Have you ever stopped to think about the sheer scale of managing a country like India? I mean, it's vast, incredibly diverse.
Mhm.
How on earth do you manage the money?
Yeah.
How do you share out wealth, tax revenues, all those critical resources fairly across all the different levels? You've got the center, the states, even down to the villages. It seems like a monumental balancing act.
It absolutely is a logistical and political tightrope walk constantly.
Exactly. And today, we're going to take a deep dive into one of the key players in that act, a fascinating, maybe slightly underappreciated part of India's system, the Finance Commission. Okay, let's unpack this.
Let's do it. Because it is crucial, but like you said, often misunderstood. It's a constitutional body right at the heart of things. And our mission today really is to pull out the most important bits, what it is, what it does, its structure, its functions, and maybe surprisingly, its advisory role. We're basing this all on some pretty comprehensive source material we've dug into.
Yeah, we've done the reading so you don't have to, essentially giving you a shortcut to understanding this complex dance of fiscal federalism in, well, one of the world's biggest democracies.
And hopefully you'll have a few aha moments along the way. Because it's not just dry finance, it's about how money shapes everything. Governance, development, people's lives.
Think about it trying to run a state, maybe the size of a European country, without knowing your core funding for the next 5 years. That's the kind of influence we're talking about here. Okay, so let's start right at the foundation. The Finance Commission is described as constitutional. What does it actually mean in practice? Why is that specific label so important for this body in India's setup?
That's the perfect place to start because it really sets it apart. Being constitutional means it's not just another government agency created by, say, an act of parliament or an executive order. No, Article 280 of the Constitution of India itself mandates its existence. It's baked into the fundamental structure of the nation's governance.
So it's part of the original blueprint, not an add-on.
Exactly. And the sources we looked at also describe it using a specific term, a quasi-judicial body.
Quasi-judicial. Okay, that sounds important, but maybe a bit technical. What does that imply?
Right. It sounds technical, but it's key to its character. It means it's not a court, not in the traditional sense, but it operates with a similar mindset. Think impartiality, evidence-based reasoning, following a structured process, almost like a legal body making a judgment.
So fairness and evidence are built into its DNA, unlike, say, a purely political committee.
Precisely. It sets it apart from purely administrative bodies or those driven by political agendas. This quasi-judicial nature gives its recommendations real weight, real credibility. It's designed to be a neutral arbiter, if you like, in these complex financial matters between the center and the states.
Okay, that makes sense. A neutral, evidence-based approach. And who actually sets it up and how often does this happen? Is it always there or formed when needed?
It's a regular thing, very much part of the rhythm of India's fiscal planning. It's constituted by the president of India. And it's not just a one-off event or only when there's a crisis.
Right.
The Constitution itself mandates its formation every 5th year, or potentially even sooner if the president feels it's necessary, maybe due to some major economic shift or unforeseen event.
So a 5-year cycle,
Yeah.
typically, that ensures a regular review.
Exactly. It underscores its ongoing critical role. It's not just a firefighting body. It's there for continuous oversight and recalibration of these crucial financial relationships. And just to give you a sense of its history, our sources point out that 15 finance commissions have been constituted so far since the Constitution began.
15, wow. What a long track record.
It really is. It establishes this rich history of fiscal recommendations, showing how it's adapted over, more than 70 years of India's economic journey. It really speaks to the foresight of the constitution makers, building in this regular checkup mechanism.
15 commissions. That's a lot of expertise channeled over the years. Each time you've got a new group taking on this massive responsibility. So who actually sits on the Finance Commission? Who are these individuals entrusted with this critical task, and what kind of background do they bring?
It's a carefully constructed team designed to cover all the bases, really. The commission has a chairman and 4 other members, all appointed by the president.
Okay, chairman plus 4.
Right. And they serve for a specific period, as set out by the president. An important point here is that they are eligible for reappointment.
So you can get continuity, people building experience.
Precisely, which is vital given how complex this all is. You need that institutional memory. Now, what's really interesting is how their qualifications are decided. The Constitution doesn't list the CV requirements itself. Instead, it empowers Parliament to determine the qualifications and the selection process.
So Parliament sets the rules for who is qualified. That adds another layer of sort of democratic oversight.
Absolutely. It acts as a vital check and balance. It means the criteria aren't just down to the government of the day, but are set by the legislature, aiming for a robust, independent, and highly competent body.
Okay, so Parliament passed a law for this.
They did. The Finance Commission Act, 1951. This act spells out the specific qualifications needed, and it really emphasizes a multidisciplinary approach.
Multidisciplinary. Makes sense. So what are the specifics? Let's start with the chairman.
Okay, the chairman. The requirement is for someone with experience in public affairs. Now, that's quite broad, but it generally implies someone with, significant experience in governance, high-level administration, or public policy, someone with strategic vision who understands the big picture, the wider societal implications of fiscal decisions, not just a numbers person.
Right, a leader who can see the forest for the trees.
Mm-hmm.
And the other four members, are they specialists?
Exactly. The other four are drawn from a very specific pool of expertise, ensuring all the angles are covered. First, you need someone who is or has been qualified to be a judge of a high court.
A legal expert. Why is that important?
Well, think about it. They're dealing with constitutional provisions on finance, complex legal frameworks governing center-state relations. Having that legal mind ensures fairness, adherence to the rule of law, and helps navigate any tricky legal issues that might pop up with these huge financial transfers. It ensures recommendations are legally sound.
Okay, makes sense. Legal grounding. What else?
Second, you need a person who has specialized knowledge of finance and accounts of the government. This is absolutely core. Someone who deeply understands public spending, revenue streams, budget processes, how government finances actually work on the ground. They can read the government's books, basically.
The nuts and bolts person. Got it.
Third, a person who has wide experience in financial matters and administration. This points towards practical experience, not just theory, but someone who's actually managed public money, implemented policies, faced the administrative hurdles. They bring that pragmatic, will this actually work perspective.
Real-world experience. Crucial. And the fourth?
The fourth member needs to be a person who has special knowledge of economics. This is vital for understanding the bigger picture, the macroeconomic impact of the Commission's recommendations. They analyze growth, inflation, poverty reduction, the theoretical basis of fiscal policy. They ensure the recommendations align with broader national economic goals.
Wow. So you've got legal, hardcore government finance, practical administration, and macroeconomics. Plus, a chairman with broad public affairs experience. That is a seriously diverse skill set.
It really is. It's designed quite deliberately to be comprehensive. By bringing together these different perspectives, legal, financial, administrative, economic, friends, the idea is to produce recommendations that are robust, well-reasoned, and consider all the potential impacts.
It sounds like, as you said, India's national financial brain trust, almost.
That's a pretty good way to put it. This multidisciplinary strength is fundamental to its credibility. It means the final recommendations aren't just one person's opinion, but a synthesis, a carefully considered consensus based on diverse expertise and solid evidence. And that's why, even though they're technically advisory, they carry so much weight.
Okay, so we had this highly qualified, diverse team. Now let's get into the nitty-gritty. What are they actually tasked with doing? You mentioned the Balancing Act. I assume the biggest part is figuring out how the tax money gets shared out. That must be where the rubber meets the road for the states.
Absolutely. That's its primary, most high-profile function. The core mandate is making recommendations to the president on, and I'm quoting roughly here, the distribution of the net proceeds of taxes to be shared between the center and the states. That's the first big piece, how much of the total divisible tax pool collected by the center should go to the states collectively. This is often called vertical devolution.
Vertical devolution. Center down to the states as a group.
Okay. But it doesn't stop there. Just as crucially, it also recommends the allocation between the states of the respective shares of such proceeds. So once you decide the total size of the pie for all states, how do you slice that pie up fairly among the individual states? This is horizontal devolution.
Ah, right. Vertical share first, then the horizontal split among the states. The impact of that second part, the horizontal split, must be enormous for individual states. It literally decides their budgets, doesn't it?
It's absolutely fundamental. We're talking about the core funding that allows states to run schools, build hospitals, maintain roads, fund police forces, implement welfare schemes. everything. This function is the absolute embodiment of fiscal federalism in action.
How do they even begin to decide that horizontal split? India's states are so different in size, population, development levels.
It's incredibly complex. They have to develop a formula based on various criteria to try and achieve some measure of equity. Typically, these criteria include things like a state's population, its geographical area, maybe income distance, how far its income is from the highest income state, sometimes forest cover, demographic performance like population control efforts, and critically, a state's own efforts in fiscal discipline and tax collection.
So a mix of need, size, and maybe even performance.
Exactly. Each criterion gets a certain weight in the formula. And deciding those weights is always, intensely debated because adjusting one weight slightly can mean huge sums of money shifting between states. A populous state might argue for more weight on population, while a geographically large but sparsely populated state might want more weight on area. The commission has to balance all these competing claims.
Tough job trying to keep everyone reasonably happy.
Or perhaps equitably unhappy sometimes. But the goal is fairness and balancing the center's revenue-raising muscle with the state's spending responsibilities, because states are often the ones actually delivering services on the ground. #BB. Guiding principles for grants and aid.
Okay, so sharing the main tax pool is job number one. But often that might not be enough, right? Some states might have specific needs or be lagging behind. Is there a mechanism for additional support beyond just the tax share?
Yes, absolutely. That brings us to the second key function, grants and aid. The commission doesn't just divide the tax pie. It also recommends the principles that should govern the grants and aid to the states by the center.
Grants and aid. So extra funding on top of the tax share. Where does this money come from?
This comes out of the Consolidated Fund of India. That's the main pot of government money. And notice the wording, again, it recommends the principles that should govern these grants.
Principles, not just specific amounts for specific projects. Why focus on principles?
Because principles ensure consistency, fairness, and predictability. Instead of just ad hoc handouts, the principles provide a framework. They might aim to, say, cover a state's revenue deficit after tax devolution, or address specific regional disparities, perhaps incentivize states to perform better in certain sectors like health or education, or even help states manage unexpected shocks like natural disasters. Having clear principles prevents grants from becoming purely political tools and helps ensure they're used effectively for targeted purposes.
So it's about setting the rules of the game for this extra support, ensuring it's fair and purposeful.
Precisely. It complements the tax devolution by providing a more targeted or conditional form of support, guided by well-defined objectives.
We've covered this center-state relationship pretty well, tax-sharing grants. Does the Finance Commission's reach go even further down? What about local governments, the panchayats in villages and municipalities and towns? They need resources too.
It does, and this is a really important aspect showing how the system connects right down to the grassroots. The Commission is also tasked with recommending measures needed to augment the consolidated fund of a state to supplement the resources of the panchayats and the municipalities in the state.
Augment the state's fund specifically to help local bodies. Interesting. How does that work? Does the Central Commission directly assess every village's needs?
No, that would be impossible. The process here is quite clever, reflecting India's multi-layered federalism. The Central Finance Commission makes these recommendations on the basis of the recommendations made by the State Finance Commission.
Ah, so each state has its own finance commission looking at local needs within that state.
Exactly. Each state sets up its own State Finance Commission, SFC. The SFC assesses the financial position of the panchayats and municipalities within that specific state and recommends how the state government should share its own resources with them and what grants they might need. The Central Finance Commission then considers these SFC reports when recommending how much the central government should give to the states to further help them support their local bodies.
That's quite a tiered system. Central FC relies on state FCs.
It is. And this specific function wasn't there from the beginning. It was added by the 73rd and 74th Constitutional Amendment Acts back in 1992. Those are the landmark amendments that gave constitutional status and, importantly, more power and responsibilities to panchayats and municipalities.
Right, the local governance reforms.
Precisely. And once you give local bodies more responsibilities, you also need to ensure they have the financial resources to carry them out. So the Finance Commission's mandate evolved to reflect that constitutional shift towards decentralization. It links national finance right down to local development.
Okay, tax sharing, grants and aid principles, support for local bodies via states. That seems pretty comprehensive. Is there anything else? What if some totally new, unexpected financial issue comes up for the country?
There is a sort of catch-all provision, which gives it important flexibility. The Commission can also advise on any other matter referred to it by the President in the interests of sound finance.
In the interests of sound finance. That sounds deliberately broad.
It is, and that breadth is its strength. It means if some major unforeseen fiscal challenge emerges, maybe managing national debt during a crisis, or needing expert advice on funding a massive new infrastructure plan, or the financial implications of climate change mitigation, the President can formally ask a finance commission for its expert, impartial view.
So it's not just locked into its 5-year cycle tasks. It can be called upon for special advice.
Exactly. It provides a mechanism for the government to tap into this independent pool of expertise for emerging issues, ensuring the Commission remains relevant and can contribute to sound financial management beyond its core periodic mandate. It keeps it adaptable.
It seems its role has definitely adapted over time, like with the local body's function being added. Were there any functions it used to have that it doesn't anymore? Anything temporary?
Yes, there was one specific temporary role right at the beginning, which again shows its adaptability. Our sources mention that until 1960, the Commission had an additional task. It suggested specific grants for 4 states, Assam, Bihar, Odisha, and West Bengal.
Grants for just those 4 states. Why?
It was related to export duties on jute and jute products. Before the Constitution, these states used to get a share of that export duty. The Constitution changed that system, so for a transitional period specifically, 10 years from the start of the Constitution, the Finance Commission recommended grants to compensate them for that loss of revenue.
Ah, a transitional arrangement to ease them into the new system.
Precisely. It was a specific, time-bound fiscal arrangement needed in the early years. Once that 10-year period ended in 1960, that particular function ceased. It's a neat little example of how the Commission handled specific historical legacies during the nation's formative financial years.
Okay, this body does a phenomenal amount of work. Detailed analysis, complex formulas, balancing competing needs. It sounds incredibly authoritative. But here's the kicker, the really interesting part I hinted at earlier. After all that effort, are its recommendations actually binding? Does the government have to follow them?
And this is where understanding the Finance Commission gets really nuanced. The answer, quite emphatically, is no. The recommendations are advisory in nature. They are not legally binding on the government.
Not binding. Seriously?
Huh.
After all that constitutional weight, the expert members, the quasi-judicial process, it's just advice.
Legally speaking, yes. The source material is very clear. It is up to the union government to implement its recommendations on granting money to the states. It's the government's prerogative.
So the government could, theoretically, just say, thanks, but no thanks, and ignore the whole report.
Theoretically, yes. There's a quote in our sources from the constitutional expert Didi Basu that puts it plainly. It is nowhere laid down in the Constitution that the recommendations of the Commission shall be binding, or that it would give rise to a legal right in favor of the beneficiary states to receive the money.
Wow. That feels counterintuitive. Why go through all the constitutional effort if it's just advice? What stops the central government from just doing whatever it wants, especially if the recommendations don't suit its political aims?
That's a million-dollar question, isn't it? And the answer lies not in legal force, but in persuasive power, credibility, and political reality. While it's not legally binding, the Commission's recommendations carry immense weight.
How so? What gives them that weight, if not the law?
Several things. First, its constitutional status itself lends it enormous prestige. Second, the rigorous quasi-judicial evidence-based process it follows builds credibility. Third, the sheer expertise of its members means its analysis is usually considered the most thorough and impartial available. And fourth, transparency. The reports are made public. Ignoring such a high-profile expert body without very good reason comes with significant political costs.
Political costs? Like upsetting the states, maybe?
Definitely upsetting the states, who plan their budgets based on these recommendations, but also facing criticism in Parliament, from economists, from the public. It undermines the perception of fairness and due process in center-state financial relations. #BB, the balancing wheel and the weight of expectations.
So even without legal teeth, it has a powerful bite because of its status and process. Does this mean it still effectively functions as that balancing wheel we talked about?
Very much so. And this tension was highlighted perfectly by Dr. P.V. Rajmanar, who chaired the Fourth Finance Commission. He made a crucial observation, quoted in our material. Since the Finance Commission is a constitutional body expected to be quasi-judicial, its recommendations should not be turned down by the government of India unless there are very compelling reasons.
Very compelling reasons. That phrase, again, what would qualify? We're not talking about just disagreeing with the formula, presumably.
No, exactly. It would have to be something extraordinary, a major national crisis, perhaps a sudden, drastic change in the country's economic circumstances that makes the original recommendations completely unviable. Or maybe a fundamental policy shift agreed upon after the report was submitted. It can't just be, well, we prefer to give state X a bit more for political reasons.
Right. It has to be a substantive, objective reason.
Yeah.
And what happens if a government did start ignoring the recommendations frequently without such compelling reasons? What would be the fallout?
The fallout could be significant. Politically, it would severely strain center-state relations. States rely on these transfers. Unpredictable funding makes planning impossible and breeds mistrust. Economically, it creates huge uncertainty, potentially destabilizing state finances and hindering development. Imagine trying to run essential services or long-term projects with that level of fiscal ambiguity.
It sounds like it could undermine the whole federal structure, really.
It could certainly damage it. That balancing wheel metaphor is apt. It might not have the engine's power, but its job is crucial for stability and equilibrium. Ignoring it repeatedly throws the whole system off balance. The weight of expectation, the constitutional propriety, the expert backing all these create a powerful political and moral compulsion, even if not a strictly legal one. ###C, the reporting mechanism. And this accountability is baked into the process itself. Once the commission finishes its work, it submits its report not directly to the government, but to the president.
Okay, to the head of state. What happens then?
The president then performs a crucial step for transparency. He or she lays the report before both the houses of parliament. But not just the report itself. It's accompanied by an explanatory memorandum from the government detailing the action taken on the recommendations.
Ah, so the government has to go on record in Parliament and explain what it did or didn't do based on the report and why.
Exactly. Even if they decide not to accept certain recommendations, which they legally can, they have to explain their reasoning to Parliament and, by extension, to the public. This ensures public scrutiny and accountability. They can't just quietly shelve the report. They have to justify their actions, which acts as a powerful check against arbitrary decisions. It forces their hand, in a way, towards taking the recommendations seriously.
Okay, so we have the Finance Commission, constitutionally mandated, acting as this crucial, though advisory, balancing wheel. But was it always the main player shaping these financial flows? I seem to recall another big body involved in planning and funding for many decades. The Planning Commission, how did that fit in?
You're right, and that's a really important part of the story, adding another layer of complexity. While the Constitution clearly intended the Finance Commission to be the primary balancing wheel for a very long period, specifically up until 2014, its role was significantly, well, let's say complicated or perhaps even undermined by the presence of the Planning Commission.
Complicated, how so? Weren't they doing different things?
Well, yes and no. The critical difference legally was their status. As we've hammered home, the Finance Commission is constitutional under Article 280. The Planning Commission, however, was non-constitutional and non-statutory. It was set up simply by a government resolution in 1950.
So one body had constitutional backing, the other didn't. But maybe the non-constitutional one had more practical power.
In many ways, yes, particularly regarding development funding. Dr. Rajamanar, our fourth FC chairman again, pointed this out very clearly. He observed an overlapping of functions and responsibilities between the Finance Commission and the erstwhile Planning Commission in federal fiscal transfers.
Overlapping functions. That sounds messy. What kind of overlap?
Essentially, you had two major channels for money flowing from the center to the states. The Finance Commission dealt largely with the statutory transfers, the share of taxes, the basic grants and aid, focusing on overall fiscal balance and equity between states. But the Planning Commission controlled huge amounts of plan assistance and discretionary grants tied to specific development projects and schemes under the 5-year plans.
Ah, so the Finance Commission handled the core constitutionally mandated sharing, while the Planning Commission handled more project-specific, maybe politically driven funding.
That's a reasonable summary. It created this sort of dual system, a dichotomy, as some called it. It meant the Finance Commission's carefully calculated recommendations on overall state needs could sometimes be overshadowed or contradicted by large plan grants flowing through a different non-constitutional channel, often reflecting central priorities more than state-level fiscal realities assessed by the FIC. It arguably diluted the Finance Commission's intended role as the sole, impartial arbiter of fiscal federalism. States often felt they had to negotiate with both bodies. ###B. The dawn of Niti Aayog, post-2014.
That does sound like a potentially confusing and inefficient system. But that changed, right? The Planning Commission doesn't exist anymore.
Correct. That whole dynamic shifted significantly in 2015. The Planning Commission was formally abolished and replaced by a new entity called NITI Aayog, the National Institution for Transforming India.
NITI Aayog. And was this just a name change or a fundamental shift?
It was intended as a fundamental shift. NITI Aayog was conceived differently, less as a top-down planning body allocating funds, and more as a policy think tank for the government, focusing on providing strategic advice, fostering cooperative federalism by bringing states into policy discussions, and monitoring progress. It doesn't directly allocate plan grants in the way the Planning Commission did.
So does this mean the Finance Commission is now back in its intended primary role without that Planning Commission shadow?
That's the big question, and the jury might still be out on the full implications. On the one hand, removing the Planning Commission arguably removes that major source of overlapping jurisdiction and discretionary funding, potentially restoring the Finance Commission's centrality in determining the overall fiscal transfers based on its constitutional mandate and formulaic approach.
That sounds like a positive step towards the original constitutional design.
It could be. However, NITI Aayog, while not allocating funds directly, still plays a significant role in shaping national development priorities, coordinating between center and states, and evaluating policies. Its influence on the overall policy environment could indirectly shape the context in which the Finance Commission operates and makes its recommendations. So, while the direct overlap in funding channels is gone, new interinstitutional dynamics involving NITI Aayog are still evolving. It's less of a shadow, perhaps, but still a significant presence in the broader fiscal architecture. The system continues to adapt.
This whole evolution, from the initial setup through the Planning Commission era to the current situation with NITI Aayog, it really highlights how these institutions adapt. To make this even more concrete, let's maybe touch on a few specific finance commissions from history. Who are some of the key people involved, and can we see this consistency in action?
Absolutely. Looking back really underscores the institution's resilience and continuity. Let's start at the very beginning. The first Finance Commission, constituted right back in 1951, chaired by K.C. Nioji. Imagine the task they faced, setting the rules for fiscal sharing in a brand new republic, with huge diversity and post-partition challenges. They really laid the groundwork, establishing many of the initial principles and methods that later commissions built upon.
Setting the precedent must have been incredibly challenging.
No doubt. Then jump forward to the Fourth Finance Commission, 1964, chaired by Dr. P.V. Rajamanar. We've mentioned him a few times. His insights on the advisory role and the Planning Commission overlap were so sharp, highlighting those inherent tensions in the system even back then.
His observations clearly resonated through the decades.
They really did. Now, let's come right up to the present, or near present. The 15th Finance Commission, chaired by N.K. Singh, set up in 2017. This one is interesting because it shows recent practice and adaptability. Due to shifts in the fiscal calendar and the economic context, including the onset of the pandemic, it actually submitted its report in two parts.
Two parts. How did that work?
First, they gave an interim report just for the financial year 2020-21. Then, they submitted their main final report covering the 5-year period from 2021-22 right through to 2025-26. This flexibility allowed them to provide recommendations aligned with the updated budget cycle and also factor in the emerging economic situation.
That's smart, adapting to the circumstances. What were some of his key recommendations, just as an example?
Well, one of the headline numbers was the vertical share, how much tax revenue the center shares with the states. They recommended maintaining it at 41% of the divisible pool. This was a slight tweak from the 14th Commission's 42%, mainly adjusted because the state of Jammu and Kashmir was reorganized into union territories, which are funded differently. They also introduced or refined criteria for the horizontal distribution, giving weight to things like demographic performance, to reward states managing population growth, and tax effort to incentivize states to raise their own revenues efficiently.
So constantly refining the formula based on national priorities and data.
Exactly. And this whole process, from setting up the commission under Article 280 to the president laying its recommendations before Parliament under Article 281, it all flows directly from those constitutional provisions we started with.
It really comes full circle.
It does. Seeing these commissions operate consistently for over 70 years, adapting to India's changing economy and politics while sticking to that core constitutional mandate, it really highlights its role as the enduring guardian of India's fiscal balance, trying to keep that incredibly complex federal system financially stable and equitable. Hashtag tag outro.
Well, this has been a fascinating deep dive. We've really unpacked the Finance Commission from its constitutional roots as this unique quasi-judicial body, through its core jobs of sharing taxes and guiding grants, landing on that really interesting point about its recommendations being advisory yet hugely influential. And we've seen how it fits into the bigger picture, evolving alongside other institutions like the Planning Commission and now NETI Aag.
Absolutely. And hopefully, for you listening, it's clear why understanding this matters. It's not just some obscure government committee. The Finance Commission is fundamental to how India, this vast and diverse nation, manages its money, balances power between the center and states, and ultimately tries to achieve fair development for everyone. It's a real-world example of how expertise and constitutional design try to work together in public policy.
It really is. It shows the mechanics behind the headlines about state funding. So, as a final thought to leave you with, given that its power relies so much on persuasion rather than legal force, how does the Finance Commission continue to shape the economic fortunes of India's states so profoundly? What are those ongoing tensions in a system that needs both strong states and a cohesive nation, relying on expert advice that isn't strictly binding? Something to ponder.
Definitely food for thought about the subtleties of constitutional governance.
We encourage you to keep exploring the intricate and always fascinating world of Indian polity. Thanks for joining us on The Deep Dive.